So let's start today with a little audience participation. Who recognizes this character? How about either of these two? One last one, how about either of these two? Well, the first is Hamlet, Prince of Denmark. Then you have Don Quixote and Sancho Panza, Alice from Alice in Wonderland fame, and the Mad Hatter. So the next one will make both harder and easier at the same time. So instead of showing you a whole image, I'm just going to show you an article of clothing. And if I hold up a deerstalker hat, I think you're all going to know who I'm talking about, because the fictional detective Sherlock Holmes is the most recognizable figure in all of Western literature. His fame even exceeded that of his creator, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And there's no better testament to that than a monument that Conan Doyle's hometown built to him. They built a monument close to where he was born of Sherlock Holmes. Now, Arthur Conan Doyle wasn't just an author. He was a scientific detective in his own right, as was Dr. Joseph Bell, his surgical mentor, and one of the people that was the inspiration for the Sherlock Holmes character. Now, Dr. Bell was an interesting character. He was very Victorian in his sensibilities, didn't talk about what he did a lot. In one of the rare instances where he was actually caught and interviewed by the press, in 1893, the Pall Mall Gazette started talking to him about being one of the inspirations for Sherlock Holmes. And there's one paragraph I just want to draw your attention to. For 20 years or more, I've been engaged in the practice of medical jurisprudence on behalf of the Crown, but there's little I can tell you about it. It would not be fair to mention that which is the private knowledge of the Crown. So he had his finger in the pie of forensic science as well. He just wasn't a surgeon. He just wasn't someone that started the profession of nursing and what it is today. He was involved in forensic science, obviously, as was Dr. Edmond Locard, the person who set up and established the first police crime laboratory in Lyon, someone that was on the sharp edge of the spear, a scientific detective if there ever was one. So today I'd just like to talk to you about the tale of three of these people who shaped modern forensic practice, but I want to tell it to you through their forensic casework. So let's start by going to Edinburgh in 1878. We're going to go to the home of Eugene and Elizabeth Chantrell. So homes back in 1878 didn't have electric light, so they were either lit by candles or they had what's known as coal gas or gas illumination. And there were pipes that were run throughout the house, and everywhere there was a lighting fixture instead of a wire, you'd actually have a pipe, and there'd be a flow of gas and a little flame. On January 2nd, 1878, the maid had come into work. She had the previous day off because it was January 1st, it was a holiday. And as she started her appointed rounds, she found Elizabeth Chantrell unconscious in bed. She got Eugene Chantrell, who then sent her to get authorities. The authorities had her go get Dr. Henry Duncan Littlejohn, who was the doctor for Edinburgh. And as luck would have it, at the time they got him, he was standing next to Joe Bell. And Littlejohn said, "Hey, you want to come see a case of coal gas poisoning?" And Bell grabbed his coat and off they went. So the first thing Bell noticed when he was on the scene is that there was a smell of coal gas, but it was not as pronounced as he would have expected. If someone was going to be overcome by coal gas, he would have anticipated that it would be a very strong smell. He also put his nose by her mouth and nose as she was being carried out to the hospital, and he didn't also notice that she smelled like the distillate products that he would have expected from coal gas poisoning. He also noticed that she had vomit on her dress, and there was vomit on the bed that she was by, specifically on the pillow. So as they carried her out, Bell picked up that pillow and grabbed it and put it aside. Elizabeth Chantrell was brought to the hospital where she remained for the rest of the day until she ultimately died. They did an autopsy, but while they were waiting on results, Bell pulled out that pillow. And looking at that pillow and looking at the fact that she was vomiting, which was not a symptom you would see with coal gas poisoning, he ran some tests on it, and sure enough, he found opiates. Now, armed with all this information, police re-looked at the case, and they saw that Eugene Chantrell had an abusive relationship with Elizabeth for a lot of years. 2 months before the incident occurred, he had taken out a large life insurance policy on her, and 1 month before the incident occurred, he had purchased a large amount of opium from a pharmacy that was unaccounted for. All this information combined didn't go well in court for him, and he was convicted and sentenced to death. While standing on the gallows waiting to hang, he looked at one of the witnesses, Dr. Henry Duncan Littlejohn, and said, "Don't forget to give my compliments to Joe Bell. You both did a good job in bringing me to the scaffold." Now, if you're going to translate that language from 1878 to modern language, I think it would be, and it would have got away with it if it wasn't for you meddling kids. Now let's move to London, specifically to the Langham Hotel. The Langham Hotel holds a special significance for any true Sherlockian because it was at this location in 1889 that J.M. Stoddard from the American Lippincott Publishing Company met with two young aspiring authors, Arthur Conan Doyle and Oscar Wilde, to talk about future publishing projects. And at the conclusion of that meeting, Conan Doyle walked away with a contract for A Sign of the Four, and Oscar Wilde walked away with a contract for A Portrait of a Dorian Gray. But the Langham Hotel was also the location of one of Conan Doyle's true cases. A gentleman had come in from the country and stayed at the Langham. He cleared out his account before he went. He took £40, which doesn't sound like a lot of money now, but it's around $20,000, so it was a sizable chunk of change. He went out for a music hall production and came back to the hotel, around 10:15 or 10:30. And then after that, he was never seen again. So the hotel, when they became concerned, they checked and they notified authorities. So authorities came in, and as they investigated, they found all his clothes in his room, especially, the evening clothes he had, which are, again, this was a bigger deal back then than it is today because clothing was bespoke. It was both expensive and time-consuming to make. So you didn't just leave your clothes in a room if you could because it was a sizable expense. They checked with the neighboring rooms, and both parties on either side said they heard little noise through the night, but they didn't hear any signs of foul play. So where could this gentleman have disappeared to in London at 11 o'clock at night? So Scotland Yard started investigating the case, and they initially thought that this was a robbery gone wrong and expected to be patient and wait for the body to turn up. But after a week of not hearing anything, they finally consulted with Conan Doyle. And he solved this case in a very Sherlockian fashion without even leaving his chambers. He got up from after speaking with the detective, and he walked over to his desk, he consulted a document, and after he was done with that document, he basically said, well, the man's in Edinburgh or Glasgow, and he's living with another woman. So how did he get there? How did he make this rapid-fire deduction? Well, here are the links in the chain, and it's going to sound pretty simple once you go through it, just like in a Sherlock Holmes story. Since he brought such a large sum of money, he intended to disappear. And, kind of makes sense. He intended to start over because he had left his clothes, and actually because he left his fancy clothes, he was probably looking to start at a different station in life. And the only train at that hour was an overnight express to Edinburgh or Glasgow that went to a big station. There were little trains that went to places, but they went to little provincial stations, and if they went to those stations, it would have been something you would have been noticed getting off a train. So the only place you could get off a train and not be noticed was in one of these big stations. And then lastly, if someone wants to disappear, it either involves money or a woman, and in this case, money wasn't the issue. And it turned out they were able to find the person from these clues. So it was very much like one of the 56 short stories that Arthur Conan Doyle wrote of the Sherlock Holmes adventures. But his casework was not just these little quick cases. He spent a lot of time on cases and had a significant impact. So in the case of Adolf Beck, pictured here, or George Edelgy, he spent years working on their cases before he was able to get pardons from the king, the equivalent of an exoneration today, and actually a change of the entire English judicial system to include now a court of criminal appeals. In the case of Oscar Slater, he worked for 19 years on that case until he also received a pardon and the creation of the Scottish Court of Criminal Appeals. So we see that Conan Doyle was both a scientific detective, he was a criminal justice advocate, but just wherever he looked, he was trying to make the world a better place. He was trying to have a positive impact. And he sometimes did it in weird ways through his stories. Like one example was he had taken his stories and he'd sent them off to British troops that were being held by Germany in World War I. And he said, you know what? The first 3 chapters are a little slow, but once you get to chapter 4, it starts to pick up a little bit. And then he went to the books, picked up the chapters after 4, took a pin, and started punching messages by punching little pinholes under letters in the book chapters so he could get by the censors. He was essentially sending hidden messages that were hidden in plain sight. But you know what? He didn't just send hidden messages to those troops in German prisoner of war camps. He actually sent messages to us as well, to the scientific detectives. If you're familiar with the term Easter egg, It's basically the idea of something that's being hidden in plain sight. So if you look at the Raiders of the Lost Ark movies, and actually one of the hieroglyphs in one of the scenes actually has R2D2 and C3PO as part of that. We also see him running by in one of the other movies, Club Obi-Wan. So just like we see in the 40 years of production of the Sherlock Holmes canon as it's known, we see tons of Easter eggs that are laden throughout these stories. So let me just highlight a couple that I think are useful for you to know. The first is the use of the scientific method. So we see in A Scandal in Bohemia and in a couple of other stories as well, I have no data yet. It is a capital mistake to theorize before one has data. And what he's talking about, as we all know, is the scientific method. We get data, we have a conjecture process which moves to a hypothesis, then that critical loop of feeding back to the data to make sure it fits before we move to a theory. And he was basically saying you have to use this process. He was talking that science doesn't start at the laboratory door. So here, how simple it would have all been had I been here before they came like a herd of buffalo and wallowed all over it. In 1891, he's talking about the contamination of the crime scene. And guess what? We still have that problem today in 2025. The science doesn't start at the laboratory door. It starts at the inception of the investigation, which is the inception of the crime. Technique development. The first time that Holmes and Watson are even introduced, the first thing that Holmes does is run up to Watson, expounding upon his new test for blood, which is going to change the criminal justice system. He understood the need to develop new techniques to address this unique science. The development of databases, that in order to make any conclusions, to draw conclusions, you need data to compare it against. So he had vast data on cigar ashes, tattoos, soil. All the things listed here have been mentioned throughout the Sherlock Holmes canon. These databases were critical to him making conclusions. Publishing the result of scientific studies. And again, these are different publications that he refers to in the Sherlock Holmes canon, the 56 short stories and 4 novels of the entire series. And these are things that he's doing so that others can learn from what he's learned, and also to subject himself to the peer review process. Performing experiments to address unique cases and case-specific issues. And the best example of this is The Adventure of Black Peter. In this case, and I'll give you a little bit of a spoiler, the victim is actually murdered by a whaling harpoon going through them and pinning them to the wall. So the police apprehend a suspect, and as they're looking at that suspect, Sherlock Holmes realizes that things don't quite add up, so he takes that same harpoon, goes down to the butcher, hangs up a pig, and tries to see how hard it is to put the harpoon through the pig and into the wall. And realizing he's much more strapping than this gentleman was in the first place, but he still can't do it. So he realizes both that they have the wrong suspect, and he understands now where to look for the correct suspect. Avoiding cognitive bias. So cognitive bias didn't really become a thing until the groundbreaking work of Amos Tversky and Dan Kahneman in the 60s. It really didn't migrate over to forensic science till just after 2000, around 2004, 2005. But in 1904, Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes is actually talking about the pernicious nature of cognitive bias and how it can negatively affect your perception of a case. Using knowledge from past cases. And I think the best example of this is George Joseph Smith. So in this particular case, Conan Doyle was a big fan of reading the paper, and specifically, like his character, the agony columns, where he'd look and see what was going on in the crime world. And one particular time, he noticed that this person, George Joseph Smith, had the unfortunate situation come up where he'd just gotten married, and right after he'd gotten married, his bride had drowned in the bath. And that's a horrible thing. Until a little bit later, he sees the same thing repeated. And then he starts thinking that this is not an isolated thing, because drowning in the bath is not as easy as it sounds. It's a very unusual occurrence, and he thinks there's a nefarious nature to it. And sure enough, he writes a letter to Scotland Yard and said, you've got to look at this further. And they find that it's actually the bride in the bath serial murderer that came out. Using probability to interpret evidence. So throughout his using of his method, as he calls it, throughout the 56 short stories and 4 novels, we see him probabilistically approaching how to weigh the different evidence and weigh the different conclusions to make those rapid-fire deductions that he's so well known for. So we started applying probability to DNA, but we need to expand that. We need to start looking at all physical evidence, and especially pattern evidence, and characterize it probabilistically. So now, armed with all these Easter eggs, we see Edmond Locard going off to start the first police crime laboratory in Lyon. And I'm going to just talk about two of his cases, but they're two kind of interesting cases that I think illustrate some of his unique thinking. The first involves a jewelry store that was burglarized overnight. So the burglars had broken in through a basement door. They'd ripped the door off the hinges. They'd gone through the basement, tunneled through the floor, got up, entered through a safe, and taken all the jewels. So the investigators were on the scene. As they were there, they kind of figured, let's use this new resource, so they called for CSI Lyon to come out. And fairly shortly after being on the scene, within minutes, Edmond Locard says, well, this is an inside job. So what are the links in the chain that got him there? And the investigator looks at him and says, I have no idea how you got there. So he holds up a screw that was used to hold the back door on and says, what don't you see here? And the investigator has no idea what he's talking about. And he says, well, look a little closer. You don't see any wood in the thread. If this had been pried out when the door is closed, the wood would have been ripped out with it. But it's not there. So the door was in an open position, and someone used a screwdriver to remove it at the time that the screw was removed. That implies complicity with the people within the shop, inside job. This other is also a burglary case. In this case, it's a pattern where a bunch of upper floors had jewelry stolen from them, but there was no balconies outside, and there was no easy way for someone to get in or out. But in each of the cases, a window had been left open to let some air in the place. As they started looking at the commonality between the cases, they did recover some fingerprints. There was commonality among the fingerprints, but the fingerprints looked a little different. They were kind of small, almost like a child's fingerprints, and the pattern seemed kind of unusual. So whether Edmond Locard was channeling Arthur Conan Doyle with whenever you have eliminated the impossible, whatever remains, however improbable, must be the truth, or he was channeling one of his predecessors, in that particular case, C. Augustin Dupin in Murders in the Rue Morgue, saying maybe this is not from someone that's human. Now, when we say not human, we're not talking X-Files. This isn't a Scully and Mulder thing. But back in the day, organ grinders were a bit of more of a thing than they are today. Not much of a thing anymore. But before he actually went and tried to point the finger there, what he did was really interesting. He went to the zoo and he validated that he can actually collect fingerprints from monkeys, orangutans, and different species, and that, first off, he can collect them and that they're different, but they're also individual to the particular monkeys that they have, or the different species that he was looking at. And after validating his method, he then went, round up all the different organ grinders until the suspect was finally apprehended. So I think what you see with these two cases, there's only two, there's tons of cases that he's done, but they show the unique thought processes of how he got to where he did, and also how this information was really useful if it was at the inception of the investigation versus after the fact. Now, it's a unique situation when all the stars line up, when Dr. Joseph Bell, who was a highly intelligent individual who was able to make these rapid-fire deductions, but his Victorian sensibilities are such that he would have been lost to history. Was it not for one of his students and his surgical clerks, Arthur Conan Doyle, recognizing his abilities and imparting those abilities on one fictional character, and doing it so successfully in his writing style as to increase awareness of physical evidence more than any of us could ever do, more than anything in the history of forensic science. But not just on a fictional level, Conan Doyle actually helped real people, left real cases to pardons, real cases to exonerations, and changed real legal systems. And then again, you can't understate the contributions of Dr. Edmond Locard, who started the first police crime laboratory and laid the foundation for everything that we do today, who essentially, as I said earlier, he took Conan Doyle's fiction and turned it into our everyday fact. What we see is these three gentlemen cast a long shadow over everything we do today. And when I look at history, I look at it to get inspiration, and, it's hard not to be humbled by these. But as I look for inspiration, what I want to also do is inspire you and say, we've seen what they can do for forensic science. what can you do to make forensic science better? Thank you, and have a good day.